Thank you, everybody. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Zhang Zhung, for having me talk to your institute. Very much looking forward to this opportunity. You mentioned I should say a few words about myself. I first went to Tibet in 1984, 83 in Ladakh, far western Tibet, if you will. And I've been going there regularly ever since. There's been a bit of a hiatus because of the COVID. Few years I wasn't able to go, but pretty much a regular visitor to Tibet, spending some 8 years there in total. And since I did a lot of exploration. Since 1991, I've been specialized in the, if you will, the pre-Buddhist phase of Tibetan history and civilization. So my talk is going to be about tonight, is about early Tibet and Zhang Zhung, what is it and what isn't it? So here we go. A bird's eye view of late prehistoric civilization in Tibet. So we're going to look at the geographic extent, the methods and objectives, monuments, rock art, artifacts, significance of the findings, links with surrounding cultures, and the final big question, is this Zhang Zhung? So really, what is Zhang Zhung, in other words? So Tibet and surrounding territories. Let's give you a little perspective. I think most people are familiar with Tibet and where Tibet is, but in case you're not, here's a map of the Tibet and the surrounding areas. This particular map outlines TAR, the Tibet Autonomous Region, in modern parlance, traditionally perhaps at least in the West known as Inner Tibet, but Tibet also extends to all the areas to the east, and that, of course, it includes Amdo and Kham. So this vast area is also part of cultural Tibet. And cultural Tibet, of course, really includes this vast plateau, which is a very singular and important landform on the planet. It has a huge effect on the climate of the entire globe. So we're going to be looking, now this area here, of course, is the Pamir Plateau. So this is not part of Tibet, but essentially Tibet extends all the way from here, all the way across, and even beyond the cut of this map. There are areas of Tibet even here to the east of this map. But this gives you an idea of the plateau. And my talk is going to be centered on this region, the western half of the plateau. So Zhang Zhung, in a sense, can be seen as this western half of the plateau, or Upper Tibet, everything north of the Trans-Himalaya and north and west of Lhasa, essentially. So it includes basically all these big lakes regions. And we'll talk about this later. This is a map from another source, from one of my maps, but from a use for another source. But actually, the eastern part, far eastern part of Upper Tibet is probably part of what's known as Sumpa traditionally. And we'll be talking about what is Sumpa and what is Zhang Zhung as much as we can. But let's move ahead here. Now, this is a Tibet Autonomous Region Administration map. This is how the People's Republic of China politically divides Inner Tibet, or the TAR. And these little dots are, the little yellow dots are the sites I have surveyed over the last 25 years or so, 30 years. And there's about 800 altogether. Lhasa, just for your perspective, is located here. So we're going to be looking at this whole vast area in the west, which includes parts of what are now the Nakchu Prefecture and Nadi Prefecture, a little bit of Shigatse Prefecture, and a tiny bit of Lhasa Prefecture. But actually, more traditionally, which I think is a good way, especially when we're talking about the ancient past, we can see this area. Essentially, this is the Changtang, and this far western area is known as De, and the very upper part of Tibet, De, and the Changtang. So it's The talk is centered on De and Chengdang. So the methods I use are the surveys of visible structural remains. I'm looking for any signs on the surface of pre-Buddhist civilization. I have not conducted any excavations. I have over 60,000 pictures, written many books, and have as I said, more than 3 decades doing this work. But I want to make it clear from the outset, I have barely scratched the surface. Tibet before the time of Buddhism, before the 10th century, or going further back, before the time of the empire, pre-7th century, Tibet has a vast and long history, a civilizational history. And it would take decades more and scores of dedicated researchers with all kinds of expertise to really make the kind of headway we would see, say, in understanding civilization in mainland China or in Europe, for that matter. So again, we're looking at the surveys of visible ancient remains, surveys of rock art, surveys of rock inscriptions. These rock inscriptions in Upper Tibet are in the Tibetan language. Textual studies. I've worked much with Tibetan text, the oral tradition collection. That's talking with people, which I found very important and rewarding. Talking to the Tibetans themselves and seeing what they have to say about their ancient history. And the cross-cultural comparative study, chronometric analysis. Chronometric analysis is using scientific means to objectively determine the age of materials. And it underpins the study of archaeology. I have not been able to do as much chronometric analysis as I would like, but it's the beginning of a very important chapter of archaeology, is really dating the kinds of places and things that I have documented. So we're going to try to assess what is visible on the ground, develop a typology of pre-Buddhist structural remains and rock art, understand what Tibetans and Tibetan texts say about these things, develop a chronology for structural remains, rock art, and artifacts, picture the cultural complexity, political tenor, economic stature, and settlement patterns of late prehistoric Upper Tibet. Appraise where Upper Tibet fits in the larger map of Eurasia, which is, of course, a fascinating subject. I mean, Tibet, in more recent history, Tibet was often seen as a forbidden land, a closed land. But in reality, Tibet has always been part of the wider Eurasian world. Excuse me. So here's a chronology. So the late prehistoric era includes the late Bronze Age, the Iron Age, protohistoric period. These are all general dates based on the research I've done and the research of other archaeologists. And these dates, of course, are not fixed in stone. Forgive me for the pun, but they are a general guide and to what we know now about the chronology sites I'll be showing you. And we won't be talking much about the historic era, but there is a historic era. It begins in around circa 600, 620 to be more precise, and continues through the imperial period, which collapses about 850 CE. And then we have a post-imperial unsettled period of about 150 years. And then we move into a solid classical times, classical Tibetan language, and the vast output of Tibetan literature. And then we're on firm historical ground. But our talk, of course, is going to be focused on the late prehistoric era, which, interestingly, there was no written language. There are no signs, there is no physical evidence, empirical evidence for written language in Tibet before the early 7th century. However, on the far western reaches of the Tibetan Plateau in Baltistan and Ladakh, there are inscriptions that predate the 6th century in a variety of different languages and scripts, including Brahmi, Koroshti, and there are even some early scripts, early Hebrew and Chinese inscriptions in Ladakh and northern Pakistan. But we won't be talking about that today. That's just for another talk. So here, just to give you an idea here, the people of Tibet. So here, Upper Tibet, so this western half of the plateau. Now, I won't go into much detail. We only have an hour, but I will give you a little bit of very important genetic information. The latest studies, and I mean the very latest studies that have come out in the last several years, culminating in a major study published this year in 2023, show that the Tibetan genome has been in place on the plateau for approximately 5,000 years, since about 3,100 BC. Now, that genome has various components. It has regional components, but the Tibetans, as we know them today, have been settled on the plateau continually for the last 5,000 years. So we see, in other words, in the genetic makeup of Tibetans of 4,000 and 5,000 years ago and today, many common links. They share much of their genetic patrimony in common. Now, that's not to say that other people did not emigrate to Tibet in the last 5,000 years. Of course they did. But these tend to be thin demographic slivers, and they did not fundamentally alter the Tibetan genome. So let's put this in context. So the sites I'm going to be showing you, all of the sites and materials, artifacts, rock art from the late prehistoric era in Upper Tibet were created by essentially the same people in a physical sense as lives there today. There have been changes, and since about 500 BC, we see a pronounced amalgamation. There's a lot of regionality before 500 BC, 1000 BC across the plateau, but then this becomes then we get a lot of genetic mixing, admixture, and over the and for about the last 2,500 years, 3,000 years, we see the mixing up of the population, so that basically there are still differences, regional differences, but we see a tremendous amount of common ground genetically between, say, Amdo, Kham, Upper Tibet, Utsang, all parts of Tibet. So clearly we have a distinctive geographic entity, the Tibetan Plateau, and we have a distinctive people that goes along, that inhabits the Tibetan Plateau, the Tibetans. So we don't really, this is a map here of sites, but it says we don't really need to dwell on this. These are some of the sites and the different types of sites I have surveyed. And then these are divided into, this is an outline of the various kind of monuments we're going to be looking at as much as we can. There are residential structures, large residential structures on summits and other areas. The most important one we'll be focusing today are all stone corbelled buildings, because they're an indicator of this vast region, because the kinds of architecture, the all stone corbelled structures of Tibet are different than you would find anywhere else in the world. And of course, there are other kind of residential structures in other locations. There are ceremonial and burial monuments. So we, you can see we'll talk a little about this. I'm not going to go over all of these one by one, because we wouldn't have time to do all that. Okay, agricultural structures. Earthworks, petroglyphs, pictographs, inscriptions, and ciphers. So this makes up the bulk of the sites I have been the kinds of things I've been surveying over the last 3 decades. Now I want to talk about these all stone corbelled buildings. So you find all corbelled stone buildings in Europe and the Middle East, of course. They're Iron Age, all corbelled stone structures, say in Ireland and in other Celtic regions, and also in the Middle East and the Levant, we find all stone corbelled structures, some going all the way back to the New Stone Age and Bronze Age. The ones in Tibet are a little younger, and we'll talk about their age estimates in a little while. But these all stone corbelled buildings occupy almost all of Upper Tibet. They are also found over the border in Upper Ladakh. Excuse me. And there is one site of these very similar structures, all corbelled, but with taller elevations, taller profiles in Lhotse in Mangnam. So essentially, these buildings are really Upper Tibet, and then a little bit they're found elsewhere to a much lesser degree. So here's an artist rendition, a reconstruction of what an all stone corbelled installation looked like. One on top of a summit here. So you see ramparts here, fortifications, and then the various buildings. I want to talk specifically about Gecko Carlo, which is an all stone corbelled installation, very large, because I was able to date a piece of wood from this site that gives us a first indication of how old these kinds of residential structures are. But first, let's look a little at Gecko Carlo. This is one of the many all stone structures. You can see these are massive structures with very heavy roofs. The roofs, even on a small room, weighed tons, literally tons. And this is a very unusual form of architecture. Unlike in other places in the world, the Tibetans did not develop a true corbelled arch. Their roofs were created by using corbels along with bridging stones between the corbels, and then heavy stone slabs overlain on the bridging stones and corbels. So these are massive, massive structures. And then probably at one time, of course, the roofs were sealed, perhaps with cement, perhaps like the traditional cement arca used by Tibetans. And this is a view inside one of the structures. In the rear there, we see a very highly unusual ceremonial structure. You can see the growth of various fungi there on the walls. These structures have remained in situ, in place for a very long time, and they're very different than the structures that arose in the 7th century with the coming of Buddhism in Tibet. This is a whole nother order of architecture. This is another view of one of the levels. It's a very large installation, Gecko Carlo. This is and it's at various levels along the spine of a ridge. And this is one of the buildings. And you can see here on the left, the doorways are very small, sometimes only around 1.1 meter, 1.5 meters at most in height. And these are often windowless structures with irregular plans because of the nature of the corbelling that was done in Tibet. Another view of the structures at Gecko Carlo. This is a entrance to subterranean structures in another section of Gecko Carlo. So Gecko Carlo is between 4,380 and 4,500 meters. It's in the Gecko Carlo Valley, a vast valley that was once full of agricultural fields, but in a tremendous flood, much of the agriculture fields were swept away. And of course, there's no agriculture carried out even in the little vestiges of arable land that's left. But at some point in the past, there was this cataclysm, and the vast areas of agriculture was completely lost. We'll talk later about agriculture, because it's important for understanding the nature of early Tibet. But anyway, what I want to bring your attention to is the 8-centimeter long fragment of soft wood, which yielded a calibrated date of circa 200 BC to 100. to 100 CE. This is a small piece of wood, just several centimeters in diameter. And it's a soft wood, so it's very likely that it was cut and used shortly thereafter. So it's unlikely that that this piece of wood represents the so-called old wood effect, where you can cut down a tree a long time before a piece of wood was used in a particular structure. So it seems as though this piece of wood is a signal. It's an indication. It's a first indication. Now, we cannot say for sure when Gecko Carlo was founded, but there's a good chance that it was established between 200 BCE and 100 CE. So by 2,000 years ago, and I want to show you other evidence, some of it not as direct, that these all stone corbelled structures actually predate this period and may go back as far as around 1000 BC to the late first millennium BC. And I'll share that information with you here soon. Let's just look at a couple more of these very early all stone corbelled architecture. Now, these buildings, they don't have chortens. There are no prayer flags. They do not. There are no mani stones. Typical trappings, emblems that you find in Buddhist sites. These sites have been vacated. They've been utterly abandoned, and they are often considered haunted by the current population. There are a lot of scores, dozens of these very large installations all over Upper Tibet, particularly west of Nakchu, west of Nakchuka proper, and from Nakchu, from Naksang west, from now what they call Nima County and Shenzhen County, west of Nima, west of Banga County and Nima and Shenzhen, and all the way across the Tibetan Plateau to far west, in the Nardi Prefecture, in the old Nardi Korsum region. We find these all called stone installations. Some of them are very large size. So I just wanted to, for an example, just show you another one here. This is known as Chukso Chopo Zone, and it's a wonderful site. You can see here some of the remains of these buildings, all stone corbelled. It means that they did not use wood to build the roofs. The woods were made composed of stone. Here you can see the corbels sticking out, protruding from the walls. And here we find a fairly intact room with its corbelling and its roof largely intact. This gives you a rough idea of what how these structures were constructed. Now, there are many types of all stone residential structures. There are also smaller installations and even large installations located in other locations, not just on this in high valleys, for instance. This is Gemta. This is this particular all stone corbelled structure is located in the heart of the Mount Kailash circuit, in this famous sacred holy mountain in southwestern Tibet, and often, at least in Tibetan sources, is considered the soul mountain or the center of Shangshung. Now, this building here was constructed at 5,400 meters, more than 5,400 meters below sea level, much higher than any Buddhist installation. Yes, you would have had Repa and various Buddhist ascetics coming to Mount Kailash after the 11th century, particularly after the 12th and 13th centuries. And then they would have meditated at high elevation in other parts of Upper Tibet too, but they did not build large installations at such high elevation. The highest monasteries in Tibet, and not talking about small retreat centers, but in caves, but actually monasteries, the actual core of a monastery, above 5,100 meters or so, like in Robok and in Mount Everest area. And of course, Gyangtak Monastery, a famous Adrigun Kargyupa monastery, is located much lower here in the center of Mount Kailash at about 5,100 meters. This is a site known as Mombu. It is another all-stone corbelled installation, and it's located in Guge. So we find these same types of structures. There are a number of them, even in the Guge region. Now, Guge is a vast badlands region sandwiched between the Western Himalaya and the Trans-Himalaya, the Aila range. And this region is highly dissected, has sediments overlain since the Ecocene, even before, to about 800 meters depth, and this 800 meters of deposits have been cut by water and wind and created this fantastic badlands region. But even here, at higher elevations, mimicking the kind of topography and natural world seen in higher regions of Tibet, we find also the same kinds of structures. So all over Western Tibet, as I was saying, and Upper Tibet, from Naksang westward. Here we see one of these all-stone corbelled structures on an island known as Dodrilbu. And here's the interior. Now, this is an unusually large room because of the nature of the corbelling, which required alcoves in indented walls and creating irregular ground plans. The rooms in the corbelled structures tend to be quite small, but here's a quite large one. Now, there was some question. I first visited this site in 1999. You see this standing stone. There was some question that this may have been an original feature, but I know from my more recent survey in 2013 that this is not a original feature. In fact, when we touched the stone, it collapsed. So there were no long stones, as Tibetan call them, Doring, in these structures. However, in the Dindun site, as Mark Allendorfer has pointed out, there appeared to have been standing stones in Dindu, in a site in Guge. We'll talk more about standing stones and what they mean here in a few minutes. So this gives you an idea. This is a rough ground plan of an all-stone corbelled structure. You can see that they have a lot of these buttresses and the wall and alcoves and they're indented, and so this is necessary to support the very heavy roofs. I'll give you another example here. So very interesting, very different ground plans than you would find in more modern structures that arose in Tibet later in the 7th century. So you can see here all of these various angles. These are all necessary to support the very heavy roofs. So they're a little bit like rabbit warrens. Dark because they're windowless. Often the ones, at least not the ones that are not built on summits, tend to be built partially underground. So they have a cave-like feel to them. All right, but there are also structures. This is Shiri Monkar, a archaic fortress dating to the late prehistoric era in Guge, in Chungse region of Guge. And in Guge, in many places, in many locations, there are not a lot of stones suitable for corbelling. In some areas, there's no stones. In many areas, there's no stones at all. And so here, to adapt to the Badlands topography and lack of stones, even some archaic structures were made with wooden rafters, with wooden roofs instead of stone roofs. This is another view of Shiri Monkar. I've dated wood in two examples, three different radiocarbon assays in similar structures, one in Guge, one in the Western Changtang, and they range in date from the 3rd century CE to the 7th century CE. So clearly they were building in Guge with wooden roofs early on. And how early is another question. So also another question of how long they were using mud bricks, unbaked mud bricks, what we call adobe in the United States, in the Western Hemisphere. And we do not know how long they were making buildings with wooden roofs, with stone walls and with adobe walls. But it would seem the evidence suggests for an awfully long time. Another view of shooting Monkar. So this is a typical archaic installation, but one built with stone roofs. It's attributed to the Mun, which is a shadowy people that is believed to have inhabited Western Tibet before the coming of the Tibetans. They were a pre-Buddhist, according to folklore, they were a pre-Buddhist non-Tibetan people. But as I explained at the beginning of the talk, we know that the Tibetan genome now, and even 3,000, 4,000 years ago and more, was very similar to today's genome. Now, it is possible that a ruling elite a foreign ruling elite invaded or intermarried and came into Western Tibet and settled. Unfortunately, the genomic archaeogenetic studies that have been done to date are not fine-grained enough to give us a good picture of the demographic, of the non-Tibetan demographic composition, even though they make up a small sliver of the Tibetan genome, probably very significant in terms of their cultural impact. And we'll be looking a little bit at foreign influences later in the talk. Walled-in longstone. So now we're going to go to Doring, what are the longstones of Tibet. And there's two sui generis, two unique monuments, types of longstone monuments in Upper Tibet. One are walled-in stones. So you see here, this is an artist reconstruction, of course. We see a periphery of stones embedded in the ground with one or more standing stones, often aligned in the cardinal directions or slightly off of the cardinal directions, sometimes with a portal, if we can call it that, in the eastern wall, and with the invariably with the long stones on the western side, and sometimes extending along the other sides too. But the stones are in the west and facing in the east, and almost without exception, these sites, and I've surveyed many dozens of them all through Upper Tibet, west of 88 degrees, 30 minutes. These sites, almost without exception, have vast eastern vistas. So probably their building, their ritual use had something to do with the sun and its regenerative capacity. These walled-in longstones are often located in the vicinity of tombs and other kinds of funerary structures, ritual structures. However, these walled-in pillars do not appear to have had mortuary use. In other words, they're not bones, human remains that were interred here. These sites appear to have had ceremonial or ritual functions. But they are very important. As I say, they're a sui generis monument marking the extent of Upper Tibet. They are found in all regions of Western Tibet, all regions of Upper Tibet west of Bangash and Bangkot, Duklung Chupsum, but anyway, now known as Banga County, and including in Guge. Now, this is just a map of the sites to give you an idea. You can see how they're distributed, as I was just explaining. We have here a couple just in the edge of Guge, in the periphery of Guge, and other ones here. So we see whether we're talking about the southern part or the northern part of Upper Tibet. We find these monuments. So they overarch the entire region. Again, of course, as far east as the western fringes of Balkan. Now, this is, we look at some of these actual monasteries. Kusei Doring, you can see the walls, not so well preserved. We see the long stones, the menhirs on the west, in the west. And we can see these stones are highly eroded. Here's Gorchen Doring. Here's another example, just two stones. We can see not much is left of the enclosure, but clearly there was one. And then we have here's a close-up of some of the long stones, Chengde Doring on the left, Belmo Dopur on the right. You can see these very highly eroded long stones dating to the late prehistoric era. When they were first established and for how long they were constructed is not clear, but because they're very widely distributed and with various permutations, structural permutations, it would seem that they were used and built for a relatively long period of time in the late prehistoric era. Another example is some of the long stones are made of various materials, volcanic stones like porphyry, igneous rocks like granite, and other types of hard stones that can be shaped. They tend to be very crudely hewn or unhewn. But this is also part, the enclosure here is hard to see in this perspective, but these stones were erected in the enclosure. Here's another view. I just picked it because I thought it was kind of a nice view of long stones in Doring Sota, another one of these sites. So we're not looking at we're just looking at the eastern row, the east row of stones there. So a quick look. So this is, so I want to talk specifically now about Chunak Doring. Chunak Doring Chunak Doring, Blackwater Long Stones, is located in what's now called Munzer Township, but Munzer is an old name, and in the county of Gar, in the old Gar region. Munzer, of course, is an old name. It means the scattered remains of the Mun, and so it's part of that Western Tibetan folklore that at one time there was a tribe known as the Mun that inhabited the region. Now, why I want to show the site is because it's located in the Chunak Valley, which is upstream of Kardom, which is the best candidate we have for the old kingdom of Zhang Zhung, as described in Old Tibetan texts, Kyunglung Mukar. So these kinds of structures are found in Guge, as I was saying. And the Chunak is a very large funerary complex, including these walled-in pillars. However, it has some unusual morphological characteristics that sets it apart from other walled-in pillar sites. There is a much more conventional walled-in pillar site even further downstream in Guge, near Kyungwon village. Chunak Doring is important because it shows because of its size and complexity. Now, I first learned of the site many years ago. I did a preliminary survey in 2002, and then we passed on the information to our Chinese colleagues, archaeological colleagues, and then they came several years later and did work there. They came to the conclusion, again, just through surface surveys, and perhaps more thorough than mine, but they came to the conclusion that this was a residential site and that all of the various funerary structures actually were the remains of homes. But as Mark Aldendorfer pointed out last month, there are no pottery shards found on the site. And of course, when we look at it at this site carefully and compare it, we can see that it has many parallels with walled and pillar and other types of funerary sites all through Upper Tibet. And so it's a ritual or ceremonial site, not a residential site. All right, let's continue here. So here we are, the walled pillars. These are the two pillars. It's actually an enclosure that's subdivided in two with one pillar in each. Now, how many pillars may have been there originally? It's hard to say. But now we just have two lone pillars at the site. This is another view of pillars. And down here, way down, you can see my cursor here, is Kardong, the best candidate we have for a capital of Zhang known as Kulong. So very close and up valley. It's very likely that the ritual and ceremonial functions of this site were complementary with the residential functions of Kulong. Of course, as I said, my work just scratches the surface. We need much more chronometric, much more absolute dating of sites, and much more study of archaeological study of all kinds to really understand how these ancient ceremonial, ritual, and burial and residential sites interacted with one another in any given time period in the late prehistoric era. That's the next chapter of research, and it will take a long time to do, but very rewarding work, I believe it would be. So here we have another site of a large pillar here in the DR2 in the south section enclosure on the right. You can see it's highly eroded. And on the left, we see these interconnected enclosures. So we find these kinds of large interconnected enclosures covering significant areas and other places in Upper Tibet as well. So these kinds of typologies, the Longstone and the enclosures are well known throughout Upper Tibet. Another view of the funerary enclosures. Again, these are not the foundations of houses or anything to do with giant tents. These are superstructures, whether they are sepulchral, whether they contain human remains or other types of deposits, human deposits, human inhumations, or that they were used for ritual purposes, or is unclear at this time. We'll talk a little bit more about these enclosures in a few minutes. So I just want to show you here, and I'll give you a picture. This is Kardong, number 1. And number 2 is where these burials we're going to be talking about in Gurujam were located, first discovered in I think it was 2006, as Mark explained last month, when a truck ran over, parked on one of these graves, and then it collapsed in the roof of this shaft tube. 3 is another site of residential structures associated with caves, but they're also freestanding residential structures, another archaic site, a late prehistoric site. And then 4 is what we were just looking at, Chunak Doring, this large necropolis, including walled pillars and various types of funerary enclosures. Oh yes, here's a large tumulus at Chunak Doring. So there's also one large tumulus. There are many tumuli, many mounds with funerary functions, or maybe other types among them. We know that with other functions, but in the main, it would appear that most of these type of mounds in Upper Tibet, as in Central Tibet, though they're a little different in Central Tibet, they tend to be trapezoidal in form, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of work has been done on Central Tibetan funerary mounds by Guntram Hazard, and I would encourage you to look at his work if you want to know more about Central Tibetan burial monuments. But here we're in Upper Tibet, and we're looking at a typical mound, and this is a very large archaeological feature, monumental feature at Chunak. You cannot see this clearly on Google Earth, but you can see the walled and pillar sites on Google Earth if you know where to look. Now we go to another, perhaps I would say even quite spectacular in many respects because of the size and extent. Another type of funerary ritual monument. And I now call these long stone grid necropolises, LSG necropolises for short. I've played around with other names, but essentially they consist of a temple tomb, a structure that appears to have functioned as a temple tomb in the east, a temple tomb in the west, to which a concourse of standing stones is appended on the east. And again, just like the walled and pillars, these sites are often aligned in the cardinal directions or somewhat off of the cardinal directions. And here we have an example of a smaller, an artist's concept of a LSG necropolis, a small example. And here we have examples, artist conception, partial reconstruction of much larger LSG necropolises with their concourses of standing stones and large structures that appear to have been all stone corbelled. We know from where these sites again occur in the same region, in the same territorial compass as a walled-in long stones and all stone corbelled buildings, helping to chart a Upper Tibetan monumental profile, cultural profile. We'll look at that later in the talk as much as we can. These structures, as I said, they appear to have been all stone corbelled structures. They contain what appear to be large tombs. They have no windows. They have no doors. They had flat roofs, though none of the roofs exist, are intact, though. On a few sites, we see hints of the corbelling. What I also want to show you, excuse me, notice this construction here. We see these bond stones, and then also these courses of herringbone masonry, along with the slab construction. Of course, at one time they were probably covered with mud plaster and maybe painted brightly with mineral pigments, but we have no evidence of that at this time. And that's, of course, is another chapter for archaeology to understand these sites better and to understand them even at the microscopic and molecular levels. And there remains and vestiges of what there might be left at some of these sites. Again, like the walled and pillars, these sites do not appear to this long stone, the concourse of long stones do not appear to contain burials. So there is folklore, there is a oral tradition that horse bones were buried under the concourses. And along with the concourses of standing stones, there are these parallel slab wall structures in some of the large sites. And these sites could be gigantic. Some of these structures could be up to 65, 70 meters in length, and with up to 3,000, perhaps even a little bit more, 3,000 standing stones. We'll look at pictures here in a minute. So these, in any case, these were the largest long stone or menhir monuments anywhere in Inner Asia. So here we have, again, we see that the extent of these long stone, of these LSG necropolises extends over the same area as the walled pillars, and very similar to that of the all stone corbelled structures, residential structures, although the corbelled residential structures are also located deeper into Guge. In Guge, we find this site near Guge, near the Cardon Mesa, near the putative site of the Xiangshu capital, Kyungmo-Nukar. We just several kilometers from there, we find one of these large LSG necropolises. We'll be looking at that in a moment. Okay, so let's first look at Kangmar Zashak, the talus blanketed red house, because this is an LSG necropolis. Foot bones that during my first survey, my visit coincided in the aftermath of flooding that cut open a tomb, and I was able to collect two samples of tarsals, foot or hand bones. Anyway, they yielded a radiocarbon date of circa 950 to 800 BC. And so this is the first indication we have of how old these LSG necropoli may be. This tomb is located in between two of these LSG complexes. This Kangmar Zasha contains three sets of mausolea or temple tombs and a number of and concourses, longstone concourses, but in between them are tombs. The tombs are located in more peripheral locations, which in itself suggests that the tombs are ancillary, are an addition, are a complement to the Longstone necropolises and not something that came after. So these date may well hold as a preliminary indicator of the age of these LSG necropolises. So talus blanketed red house is located at the border of what's now known as the Nagchu and Nari prefectures, really in the middle of the Chengtong, as you can see there. This is a view. This is a more close-up view. We can see north is the parts of Gyurtse here, and and this is La Corso here is another prominent topographic land signpost. This is Naksang here to the right, and then this area here would be Gyurtse Noro, or there are also more ancient aspects of Gyurtse, particularly to the south here, parts of earlier clan configurations that still exist in the area. We won't be able to talk too much about oral history and ethnography, not even too much about text today. I'm sorry about that, but I want to give you a global view, bird's eye view of the archaeology, and then I'll bring in as much as I can of the oral tradition and archaeology and textual research later, as much as I can. So we see again, as I was mentioning, there's three complexes of standing stone and temple tombs, spaced quite far apart. This is an unusual configuration because they're almost directly in an east-west trajectory, within 1 degree of variance. So clearly, the east-west axis, sighting in the cardinal direction, was an important consideration for the builders of this LSG necropolis. Okay, this is the central complex, I believe, of Kangmar Zasha. Now, of course, many of the standing stones are missing. They've been uprooted, or they were carried away for buildings, building projects, what have you. Even the temple tomb in the west, in the rear, is heavily degraded. If this site is indeed 2,800 years old, it comes as no surprise. This is the west complex at Kangmar Zasha. Here, even there's even a sparser array of standing stones, of long stones. Most of them, 70% or so, are missing. They've been uprooted. But you can see enough of the standing stones to get an idea of the form, of the plan of these concourses. They tend to be quadrate or rectangular in form. Okay, now we want to go to another one. We're going to go to Tobo Marhang. It has several different names, but you can see here in the foreground the standing stones. Some of them are broken, most of them are uprooted, and then we have the large temple tomb in the on the west side. Now, I wanted to point out that this is also, I wanted to focus on this side because it's also very close to Klardong, what may be Kyumlung, the capital of Zhang Zhung. It's located, actually, this region traditionally was not known as Guge, even though it's very, very close to Kardong. This is known as the Charisuden region, Charisuden, and it extended south into Upper Burang at one point. It's mentioned, it figures in Yungjung histories of Shangshung and ancient Western Tibet. Here's another perspective on Tobo Marang. You can see now it's not, there are some integral wall sections, fragments left, but mostly it's now just more or less a heap of rubble. Some long stones. These long stones in Upper Tibet tended to be smaller than you would find in other regions of Inner Asia, other regions of Eurasia, for that matter. To be smaller in size. So this stone here, I think, is 1.4 or so, 1.5, extends 1.4, 1.5 meters out of the ground. You don't find the giant menhirs, like you say you would find the deer stones in Mongolia and southern Siberia, for instance. They tend to be smaller, but this is in keeping with the high elevation. Things tend to be closer to the ground in Upper Tibet. Think of dwarf willow. Instead of large willow trees you would find in low elevation, or large poplar tree you would find at lower elevation. The trees here tend to be smaller, stunted. The same with the juniper. Juniper grows as a shrub, not as a tree. It's a harsher, it's a high elevation environment. It's so important for understanding ancient civilization in Upper Tibet is that it's a very high land, averaging about 4,700 meters above sea level. Even here in far western Tibet, it averages about 4,400 meters above sea level. It's the highest land. It's really the highest land that human culture took root, not just sedentary human culture took root. A people with significant monuments and artifacts, and we'll look at that in a few minutes in more detail. Oh yes, this is another view here. This is the most intact the most intact side. I believe this is the north side. You can see the bond stones here in between courses of the masonry. And here we have, you can see the chambers here in the top of the temple tomb in Tobo Marang. Some put prayer flags here, probably to honor or appease a local deity. Kyumlung or Kardong is located here on the upper left side, but you can't see it. It's a little off of this view picture. You can't see it you cannot see it. It's not an eye shot from the LSG necropolis, but it's close. Okay, so Guge and surrounding regions of Upper Tibet, all stone corbelled residential structures, walled and long stone grid necropolises, cognate rock art, complementary geographic qualities, strategic links, burn text closely linked Guge with other parts of Shangshung and the Chengtang. Um, and Old Tibetan text also mention Upper Tibet as a region that extended to Gugay and other areas. So, interesting, bone historical and biographical texts refer to Gugay as Zhang Zhung. So, for later in classical Tibetan histories, Gugay was Zhang Zhung for all intents and purposes. Now, there are even Burn texts talk about a partition between Gugay and other parts of Upper Tibet. And this area of Gugay, according to Lopin Tenzin Namduk, the foremost Burn scholar, this partition is known as Karak, and Karak is Gugay, early Gugay. Gugay, of course, is the Shangshung name, interestingly enough, like Kurham, and many other place names, toponyms in Western Tibet. And this is a Mukti, etc. I mean, this would be a very fascinating study for someone to look at, to collect toponyms and look at the etymological roots. So anyway, to make a long story short, Gugay and surrounding regions of Upper Tibet have a tremendous amount in common. However, there is regional specialization. The tombs found in the Badlands of Gugay tend to be pit tombs, shaft tombs, tombs with very little in the way of significant superstructures. Most of the fortresses were built with wooden roofs. And these, of course, are geographic adaptations, but also reflective probably of some regionalization. I would not go as far to characterize Gugay and the rest of Upper Tibet as two different cultures or even two different polities. I think they're closely interrelated as Tibetan text would have it, but still, it does not mean that they're one in the same. They could have been part of overlapping cultural regions is probably the best way to phrase it. May have been part of the same polity, may have not, depending on what time period we're talking about. We don't know yet. This is Yulkumbu in the western Changtang in the Rishi region. It contains 6 of these very large concourses and temple tombs. Altogether, the 6 complexes had about 10,000 standing stones. That's an estimate. There's still over 4,000 still standing. This is a magnificent site. One of the most important necropolises anywhere in Tibet, in Asia, Inner Asia, and really, this site stands head and shoulders with necropolises anywhere in Eurasia. It's Tibetan, it's Upper Tibetan. If you want to call it Shangshung, we'll see if you can or not. It depends really largely on your perspective. This is a very important site I first surveyed in 1999 and revisited once. And unfortunately, I've not been able to go back and do more thorough work since then. This is another one of the LSG complexes at Yulkumbu. You can see here, I mean, many hundreds of standing stones. You see the large temple tomb here in the background. This is a close-up of one of the temple tombs. You can see again the bond stones, and then also the courses of herringbone masonry, and then other types of masonry, more lateral forms of coursing. See Shangshung in cultural terms, linguistic terms, and political terms. And the 3 are not necessarily the same, or they did not necessarily occupy the same area. Let me give you an example. Okay, Italia has mostly Italian speaking, but there are German speaking speakers in South Tyrol. They're part of the Italian polity, the Italian state, but they speak German. So languages and politics don't necessarily correspond. The same with a culture. You can have in France, you have French culture, Gallic culture in most of France, but in Alsace, you have a lot of German culture, part of the same state, but different cultural entities to some degree or another. So likewise with Shangshung, we have to differentiate. And then I wanted to speak about, is it Shangshung or isn't it? Well, that also depends on how you define Shangshung and what period. So anyway, to make a long story short, Shangshung is it's best to use a word, if you're going to use a word, as a shorthand for Upper Tibetan civilization in the late prehistoric era. It's best then to append it with what period you're talking about and what place. So you might say Shangshung Bronze Age, Shangshung Iron Age, Shangshung Protohistoric period. If we take a strict textual interpretation, looking at the Sui and Tang annals and old Tibetan manuscripts, we cannot postulate a Shangshung before the late 6th century. And we know that Shangshung collapsed in the early to mid 7th century. So before that, if you want to call protohistoric or late Bronze Age, Upper Tibet Shangshung, you can, but there is no textual historical evidence to support that. Looking at the archaeological evidence, we have this large array of monuments and rock art and artifacts that cover a large area that speak of a singular culture, or a singular culture, maybe, as I say, with some regional differentiation. And that we might call Shangshung as a shorthand, but again, I think prudence dictates that you use the word, giving it a spatial and temporal specificity. Thank you very much, everyone.